He moved slowly beneath the dim floodlights of the Arizona Air Base, cloth in hand, wiping dust from the cold metal skin of an F-105 Thunder Chief. "There he is again," a young recruit muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Does he really think anyone cares about that rust bucket?" Laughter followed, but the old man didn't flinch. Elijah Monroe didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't even look up. He just kept polishing, like he had every morning for years. They thought he was a nobody, just an old retiree chasing ghosts. But someone was watching. A name from the past had resurfaced. A file was opened. A memory jolted awake. And when a certain general finally recognized him, the entire base fell silent. The laughter stopped. The truth landed harder than any plane ever had. Because when honor is buried too long, its return echoes like thunder across the desert sky. If you've ever believed that dignity speaks louder in silence than in words, this is the story you stay for. Type honor. If you felt that shift in your chest the moment he didn't answer back, and if you're someone who still believes we owe something sacred to those who came before us, then this place, this channel, was made for you. Elijah Monroe was 84, but he carried himself with the quiet precision of a man still living by military code. His back was slightly stooped, his frame lean from years of rationed meals and desert heat, and his hair, what little remained, was a soft gray cropped, short above weathered features that looked carved from Arizona stone. Each morning, before the sun broke over the horizon, Elijah dressed in a clean buttoned shirt tucked neatly into old khaki slacks, then slipped on his faded bomber jacket, a relic older than most men on the base, and drove his rust-colored pickup to the gates of Claiborne Air Force Base. He never said much. Didn't need to. His routine spoke louder than words. Park, nod to the guard. Walk to the old F-105 Thunder Chief standing on display like a forgotten monument. Then, with hands that once gripped the stick through enemy skies, he'd gently clean the fuselage. Every curve, every rivet, like he was tending to a brother. He'd been doing this for over 3 years. No fanfare. No explanations. Elijah lived alone in a small adobe house at the edge of town. No wife. No children. Just shelves of dusty aviation books and a framed photo of men in flight suits, some marked with black X's. He had served 32 years in the United States Air Force, flew rescue missions in Vietnam, earned medals he never displayed, and carried the kind of silence only men who've seen too much can bear. To the young pilots and gate officers, he was the old guy with the airplane thing. They chuckled when they saw him, made up stories to pass the time. No one stopped him. He wasn't doing harm, but no one really saw him either. Until one morning, a rookie muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. And one of the guards gave a look, not curiosity, not respect, but a smirk of coming trouble. Something was shifting. The next morning began like every other. Elijah parked his truck by the gate, nodded at the young recruit barely old enough to shave, then made his way to the Thunder Chief. The sun had just begun its slow rise behind the hangars, casting long shadows across the tarmac. He laid his worn cloth against the wing, fingers brushing gently over metal that once trembled with war, when a voice, too firm and too rehearsed, broke the silence. "Sir, we need to talk," said a man in uniform, Sergeant Damian Cross, head of internal security. He walked with purpose, clipboard in hand, like the conversation had already been written. Elijah turned slowly, his eyes calm, alert, not surprised. "Is there a problem? Can I see your ID, please?" Elijah reached into his back pocket, pulled out a thin, worn wallet. The sergeant unfolded the laminated card and read aloud, "Elijah Monroe, date of birth, retired Air Force, 32 years of service." He paused. "Everything seems in order, Mr. Monroe, but I'll need to ask you a few questions. Standard procedure." "I understand," Elijah replied softly. "Why do you come here every day?" Elijah glanced toward the plane, its nose gleaming with early light. "I just like to keep it in good shape." Cross scribbled something down, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Monroe, you need special authorization to interact with display equipment. Until we process that, I'll have to ask you to stop coming here." The words fell like cold ash. Elijah stood still for a moment. Then, without protest, he folded the cloth slowly, packed his small bag, and gave one last look to the Thunder Chief. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't raise his voice. He just turned and walked. No one stopped him. Not the guards who'd seen him for years. Not the officers sipping coffee from the admin wing. Not even the young airmen who had once laughed as they passed. Silence followed him like a shadow across the gravel lot. That day, the aircraft stood untouched. And the next. And then the next. Dust began to settle on its skin. Some noticed. Quietly. One officer muttered over his paperwork, "It's strange without him here." But no one said it out loud. Except one man. Colonel Grant Aldridge sat in the command office late one night, reviewing security notes when he paused at the name. Elijah Monroe. He blinked. That name. There was something about it. Some old memory clawing its way through the years. He rose, walked to the base archive wall, and ran his fingers along a row of faded photos, until he stopped. A black and white image. A line of pilots receiving honors. One face, mid-30s, unmistakable. The caption read, "Captain Elijah Monroe, awarded the Air Force Cross for extraordinary valor." And just like that, the silence shattered. Colonel Grant Aldridge stood motionless in front of the wall of historical portraits, the morning light casting long stripes across the aged photographs. And then he saw it. Tucked between black and white frames of medals and flight crews, there it was, a 1972 Air Force ceremony photo. Dead center. A young man in his 30s, jaw firm, posture unshakable, one hand on his helmet, the other reaching out to receive the Air Force Cross. The plaque beneath didn't stutter. Lieutenant Elijah Monroe. Extraordinary Valor. Rescue Operations, Southeast Asia. Aldridge stepped back as if struck. His throat dried, fingers clenched, eyes not blinking. The man the guards had turned away yesterday had flown 47 combat missions, saved 200 lives, and had stood where legends were born. And they'd called him a nuisance, a liability. He didn't hesitate. "Get me command archives, now," he barked. Within the hour, a convoy vehicle stopped outside a small house on the outskirts of town. The air was still. The wind didn't move, but when the car door opened, something in the atmosphere changed. Feet hit the gravel, slow, measured, not loud, but unmistakable. General Barrett Crane, commander of the Western Air Division, and a man whose name had filled briefing rooms for over 3 decades, stepped out. He didn't look around, didn't ask for directions. His boots struck the earth like anchors. His chest bore only one ribbon, the one that mattered. And his eyes, sharp, dark, unrelenting, scanned the base entrance until they landed on the F-105 tight. Silence followed him like a shadow. Guards straightened before realizing who they were standing before. Pilots stopped mid-stride, conversations hanging in mid-air. "Wars is a day of a white war. Warning chase going inside." Even the breeze seemed to step back. Crane didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence did what words couldn't. Then, without turning, he said just 5 words. "Where is Mr. Elijah Monroe?" No one answered. No one needed to. A single junior officer pointed toward the hangar hall, the exact one where Aldridge now waited. Crane walked, not fast, not slow, but like a man who knew every nail under his boots had once been put there by men like Elijah. Inside the hangar, Aldridge rose to meet him. Salute sharp. "General, We made a grave mistake." Crane didn't return the salute. His eyes fixed on the dossier in Aldridge's hands, then flicked toward the tarmac. "Get him back here, immediately." He didn't need to raise his voice. Outside across the base, whispers moved faster than orders. That someone had come. Not to reprimand, not to review, but to make things right. And as the sun slipped behind the hangars, throwing a golden hue across the Thunderchief's dusty frame, no one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone, from rookies to veterans, understood one thing the moment General Crane arrived. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. When General Barrett Crane stepped onto the tarmac, no orders were issued, yet every man within view stopped breathing. He didn't walk fast. He didn't need to. His presence carved silence deeper than any shout. Inside the operations wing, Sergeant Damian Cross stood beside his desk, arms folded, lips curled into a smirk, unaware his moment of reckoning was already unfolding behind the glass. The door creaked open. No fanfare. No announcement. Just Crane. His boots echoed once across the concrete floor, then stopped, right in front of Cross. The two locked eyes. Crane didn't blink. "Sergeant Cross," Crane said, voice calm, steady. "Yes, sir." Cross gave a lazy salute, one beat too slow, laced with sarcasm. "You're the one who removed Mr. Monroe from this facility yesterday." Cross didn't flinch. "Protocol, sir. He was tampering with a retired exhibit. No clearance on file." Crane tilted his head slightly, not in curiosity, but in disappointment so quiet it scraped bone. "You ran a background check?" "I followed the report. Anonymous tip. We've had issues with stolen equipment. You know how it is." "No, I don't think you do." Crane reached inside his jacket, pulled out a folded document, and laid it gently on the desk between them. A photo, a metal citation, a combat record, all bearing one name. Elijah Monroe. Cross glanced down, scoffed. "I mean, that's ancient history. Doesn't change protocol." Crane's eyes sharpened, not loud, not furious, just absolute. "Ancient history," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "You dismissed the man who once flew through flak storms to rescue your predecessors, who spent 3 decades protecting men you now salute, and you didn't even ask for his name." The room tightened. Staffers froze mid-step. Bottle. Radios crackled, then went mute. A cup of coffee trembled slightly on a nearby table, but no one reached for it. The air, thick enough to hold still. Cross laughed, nervous now. "Look, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to be held accountable?" Crane asked, interrupting without raising his voice. Then came the silence. Crane slowly lifted a small, outdated badge, faded but real. Elijah's retired access ID, hidden in archives, untouched for years. He placed it gently beside the report. "You filed your complaint at 10:02. This ID was active until 10:07. 5 minutes, Sergeant." Cross' throat moved. He didn't speak. His fingers twitched, the kind of twitch men make when they realize the air around them has shifted, and they're on the wrong side of it. Crane didn't move again. He didn't need to. Because everyone in that room, every soul with a uniform or clipboard, suddenly saw the moment for what it was. This wasn't a correction. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The video played without sound. Just grainy security footage on the command center's main screen. Silent, but louder than any voice in that room. There was Elijah Monroe, 72, in his worn bomber jacket, hands clasped behind his back, standing still at the far end of the hangar. Cross' voice could be read from his lips, sharp, condescending. And then, Cross reaching forward, ripping the name tag off Elijah's jacket with 2 fingers and tossing it to the floor like trash. Not a word was spoken in the room. Not yet. The footage cut to another angle. Cross pushing Elijah back with 2 fingers to the chest. Elijah never lifted a hand. He just picked up the tag and left the screen. No struggle. No retaliation. Just dignity. In silence. General Crane stood at the center, unmoved. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. From the rear door, Major Camille Rowe, head of internal oversight, walked in. Her clipboard rested flat against her chest like a shield. Her voice was steady, clipped, emotionless. "Sergeant Damian Cross," she said, "you are being placed under internal review for abuse of authority, falsifying incident reports, and conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer." Cross turned pale. "Ma'am, the footage, it doesn't show the whole." "Don't tart moi." Her eyes narrowed. "You had a chance to tell the truth before." That moment passed. A murmur moved across the room. Technicians, staffers, junior officers. One whispered, "That's Elijah Monroe?" Another added, "I didn't even recognize him." A young airman stepped back from her console, visibly ashamed, and whispered, "We all just watched it happen." Cross tried to speak again, but couldn't find the sentence. His jaw opened, then shut. He glanced at General Crane. No help. Looked at Major Rowe. No mercy. Looked at the door. No exit. Then, slowly, he took one step back. And for the first time since the beginning of this mess, he lowered his eyes. A heavy silence followed. And in that silence, Elijah stepped forward. He didn't say a word. Didn't glare. Didn't accuse. He simply walked past Cross, picked up the name tag from the floor. A copy laid down for the hearing, and placed it back in his pocket, right where it used to rest. Then he turned to leave. As Elijah passed the last row of seats, everyone in that room stood, not by command, not by cue, but by something older, something deeper, a respect long overdue. Behind him, Major Rowe nodded once, and Cross was escorted out in silence. No handcuffs, no shouts, just the cold echo of boots walking a man out of the honor he thought he owned. No one asked him to stay. No one blocked his path when he turned toward the exit. And yet, no one left. The air was thick, not with tension now, but with something quieter, heavier, guilt that didn't need to be named. The young tech sergeant was the first. Same one who'd watched without blinking when Elijah was insulted hours before. Now, with the cafeteria almost empty and chairs askew like an aftermath, he stood up slowly, walked to Elijah's table, and picked up the name tag that had been kicked to the ground. He wiped it gently with his sleeve. "Sir," he said, not loudly, but with weight, "you dropped this." Then he placed it down like it mattered. The woman with the clipboard followed. Her steps were unsure, like each one pressed against something unspoken. She carried a folded American flag napkin. Not regulation, not protocol, just personal. She didn't speak. She placed it next to Elijah's untouched coffee. Her hands trembled. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, just stepped back into silence. Another brought over a silver coin. Military challenge coin? Aged, worn. Maybe once his. Set it down beside the napkin. Then turned away. A young man who hadn't even been born when Elijah marched overseas, who had laughed earlier when the insults flew. He now stood still, eyes on the floor, whispering to no one in particular. "We were wrong." No grand apology. No speech. Just quiet gestures that cost nothing but pride. A filled cup. A seat pulled out and left empty beside him. An old-timer in civilian clothes removing his hat without being asked. Elijah said nothing. He didn't smile. Didn't cry. Just rested one hand on the flag napkin, the other over the coin. His gaze fixed on the window, where the flag outside moved with the wind. Slow, almost reluctant, like it too had been waiting. Then came his only words. "It's not about who salutes you. It's about who remembers why they should." And in that stillness, something shifted. The dishwasher in the back stopped humming. The young staffer who had once mocked his name began clearing nearby tables with care, placing each chair back into line like restoring order. A second lieutenant whispered, "He served here, long before any of us did." When Elijah stood, he did so slowly, not out of weakness, but ceremony. He nodded, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself. A nod that forgave without erasing. That honored without demanding. That left nothing owed, yet everything felt. He walked toward the door. No one opened it for him. But when he reached it, it was already ajar. Held open, not by command, not by fear, but by someone who had once turned away, and now chose to stay. The bar had never been quiet this long, not even in its slowest hours. Yet now, days after the confrontation, it breathed a different kind of silence. Not one of tension, but of reverence. Where the chipped wall once bore faded beer signs and forgotten sports memorabilia, a new frame had appeared. Inside it, a photograph, black and white, weathered, of Elijah Monroe in uniform, eyes like steel, standing beside his flight crew on an airstrip that no longer exists. Above it, a simple plaque, "Honor, when kept silent, speaks loudest." No city official had ordered it. No press covered the moment. It was the bartender, the same man who once looked away, who had hung the frame at dawn. The flag folded beneath it had been brought in by a high school history teacher, not for decoration, but because his students had asked to learn more about the man with the cane who didn't shout. And every week since, those students had started coming. Not because of grades, but because they said his silence made them curious about things their textbooks forgot. Elijah never acknowledged the wall. Not with words. He still came at the same hour, sat at the same seat, sipped the same black coffee. No cream, no sugar. But his presence had shifted. Patrons no longer turned away. They nodded. Quietly. Respectfully. One young man once left his beer half-finished, walked over and said nothing. Just placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder before walking out with tears he didn't explain. A few weeks later, someone, no one knew who, had added a glass case beneath the photo. Inside, Elijah's old flight badge, still scratched from Saigon heat, and a folded note. It read, "Not all medals are worn. Some are carried in silence." Elijah's son, Captain David Monroe, had seen it too. He said nothing either. But when asked about his father during a base interview, he looked toward the horizon and said, "He doesn't tell stories. He teaches without speaking." And as the seasons turned, that bar became a place people visited not for beer, but for memory, for stillness, for the echo of a man who had been shamed, and by simply standing still, had taught a town how to stand taller. Elijah never raised his voice. But now, even the walls whispered his name. The booth was tucked in the farthest corner of the diner, one that didn't get much light, except for the golden slant of sunset brushing along the windowsill like a fading memory. 2 cups sat untouched on the table. One black, one with cream. A small spoon rested on a folded napkin. And across from Elijah Monroe sat Captain Marshall, no longer a Marine in full posture, just a son beside his father, both men quiet in the weight of what had passed. They didn't talk at first. The clinking of dishes from the kitchen felt distant, as if muffled by something deeper than silence. Outside, cars moved slow. Inside, time seemed to sit down with them, uninvited, but not unwelcome. Then Marshall leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug. "You okay, old man?" he asked. Not sarcastic, not light, but with the hesitation of someone who'd learned just how much one man can carry without showing it. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked down at his coffee, then up, past his son's face, out the window, where the American flag across the street barely moved. Then he gave the smallest nod, as if that was all the truth needed. Marshall reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded paper, placed it gently on the table. It was the handwritten recommendation he had submitted years ago, declined twice, asking that his father receive the recognition he had quietly refused. "They're taking another look," he said. "Thought you should know." Elijah didn't touch it, but his eyes lingered, not on the words, but on the effort. For a moment, they just sat there. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Elijah slid his old cap, creased and sun-faded, from the seat beside him, and handed it across the table. Marshall didn't speak. He just took it, held it with both hands, and placed it beside his own glass. Outside, the shadows grew longer. A waitress approached, hesitated, then placed a small apple pie between them. "On the house," she said softly, before walking away. They didn't touch the pie. They didn't need to, because in that moment, no salute, no speech, no medals. The silence between them said more than any line ever could. And when they finally stood, Elijah put a few bills beneath the empty mug, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door. Marshall followed, half a step behind. No words exchanged. Just a man and his son, exiting not just a diner, but the kind of moment that doesn't come twice. Behind them, the cap remained on the table, facing the door. Like a marker, like a memory that didn't need reminding, like a promise passed on. The story didn't end at the bar. It drifted, like smoke from a quiet fire, curling into corners of the town people thought were untouched. It found its way into a middle school history class, where a boy named Travis raised his hand, not to answer, but to ask, was that old man really someone important? The teacher, who had once seen Elijah from a distance, didn't use the word war hero. She just nodded slowly and said, "He carried something heavier than medals, and never once dropped it." At the barber shop, where laughter used to ripple at the expense of men like Monroe, there was a new silence. One of the younger men, who once called Elijah just another drunk vet, stood up when an old soldier walked in and said nothing. He just gave up his seat. At the church bulletin board, a black and white photo appeared overnight. Elijah, blurry in the background of the cafe window, with 3 words scrawled underneath in marker. Strength. Still. Stand. The remarkable part, Elijah never spoke, never explained, never claimed he was wronged. But those who had witnessed his silence began to speak in his place. At town council meetings his name came up, not in protest, but as a pause. A kind of quiet check on what it means to look down on someone simply for being older, slower, worn. It wasn't a statue or a ceremony. There were no official days of honor. But in grocery store lines, at gas stations, at Little League games, when someone said, "Did you hear what happened to Elijah Monroe?" heads would bow just a bit, conversations would soften, and something in the room would shift. A teenager who once rolled his eyes at stories of the good old days now helped fold a flag outside the school without being asked. A young waitress at the diner who hadn't seen the moment still saved the same booth, cleaning it every morning like it mattered. In the local library, someone left a note inside a worn military biography. Start here if you want to understand what dignity looks like. At the town's 4th of July parade, a small handmade sign appeared in a shop window, painted by children, hung with tape that barely held. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." No one claimed to have made it, but no one took it down. And one night, as dusk settled across the square and the wind caught the flag above the diner, a boy stood with his grandfather, pointing at the photo taped inside the glass. Elijah walking away that day, back straight, eyes ahead. Eyes ahead. The boy didn't say a word. He just watched. And somewhere, in that silence, another story began. The cafe never went back to how it was. There, above the counter, where a neon beer sign once buzzed, now hung a small wooden plaque. "This seat is reserved for those who serve." Below it, a single chair, empty, polished, facing the door, and behind it, a framed photo of Elijah Monroe, not in uniform, not in glory, but simply sitting in that same seat, hands folded, watching the world with those quiet, tired eyes. He didn't speak much that day, just looked out the window, then turned to his son and said, "One day, son, you'll realize some fights ain't about winning. They're about reminding folks who we are." And when he stood, slow, cane steady, breath deeper than the silence, the room didn't clap. It didn't cheer. It simply stood with him. Because sometimes the loudest salute is silence. If that moment said something to you, don't let it fade. Comment respect if you still believe in quiet courage. Subscribe if you think stories like Elijah's deserve to be heard. Again and again, until we remember what honor really means.